Implications are terribly serious at the moment. It'll affect some people, but it's only marginal right now.
Jim, do you see the United States going into a recession? I mean, you sound pretty bleak about what's going on in the U.S.
Well, I know that housing is in worse than a recession right now. I know that automobiles are in worse than a recession. I know that much of the financial community is in worse than a recession right now. So, yes, I suspect we're in a recession. You know, if the inflation numbers that the government reports weren't fraudulent, they would probably be reporting that we're in a recession now. But since they report fraudulent inflation numbers, that means that the economic numbers are fraudulent. So I suspect we're in inflation right now, in a recession right now, Pimm, but the government says we're not.
And Jim, you know, it seems as though you've got three pillars of wisdom. You say, get out of the dollar, teach your children Chinese, and buy all the commodities that you can. Why are you still so bullish about the commodity markets?
Well, Pimm, it's a very simple thing. First of all, nobody has discovered any major oil fields in 40 years. There's been very little investment in productive capacity for commodities at a time when Asia and demand all over the world is booming for commodities. So you have demand up and supply down. That's a bull market, and it's going to go on for years.
You talk about in your new book, you talk about commodities get no respect. Why don't they get any respect, and what's the difference between investing in commodities and investing in companies that deal with commodities, let's say mining companies?
Well, that's a good question, but for instance, many mining companies will go down even if the price of the product goes up, because you have to worry about management, balance sheets, environmentalists, hundreds of things. Remember that natural gas has tripled here in the last few years. Well, Enron was a natural gas company, Pimm. Enron went to zero. Natural gas can go down, copper can go down, but these companies can go to zero, but the products can never go to zero.
Now, in your index, the Rogers Commodity Index, it shows a dramatic outpacing compared to bonds as well as stocks. Do you expect that to continue? Are we in a super cycle, so to speak, for commodities?
Well, we're certainly in a secular bull market for commodities, because the average commodity bull market has lasted, say, 18 years throughout history, for many years, many centuries anyway. So we have a long way to go in this particular commodity cycle. They don't last forever, these bull markets. They always come to an end. But in around 2020, say, this bull market will come to an end too. But in the meantime, it's got a long, long way to go, because nobody is discovering any new supply, and demand continues to grow.
What about the mining companies that, let's say, have been spending money looking for new gold reserves? Do you own some gold, and do you think that they should be spending more money looking for things like zinc and lead and copper?
In the last few years, something like 75% of all money spent looking for metals has been spent looking for gold. Yes, I own some gold, but I own a lot of other metals as well. They obviously should be looking for tin and zinc and lead. Lead is at an all-time high right now. Lead has done 500 or 600% better than gold over the past few years. Tin has done 500 or 600% better than gold. Nobody's been looking for these other metals, and yet the world desperately needs them. That's where they should be looking now, and I suspect you're going to see that they're going to change their exploration budgets, because these prices are going through the roof.
So, Jim, for most investors, how do they actually get into the commodities play without investing in equities?
Well, the best thing to do is to do your homework and buy commodities themselves. If you're not any good at that, you can buy an index. As you know, Pimm, the academics and consultants have demonstrated that index investing outperforms 80% of active managers year after year after year. So individual commodities or an index, if you cannot do that, you can try buying companies, but you've got to be awfully good at buying shares. You can buy currencies of countries that have a lot of commodities, like Canada or Australia, or you can buy the Canadian stock market instead of the U.S. stock market. Canada is going to benefit, it already is benefiting enormously from the raw materials boom. Their economy and stock market is going to be much better than ours in the U.S.
Now, Jim, how can you buy the one commodity that you think is going to make a lot of people rich, and this is H2O, this is water?
Well, I know the water is turning into one of the gigantic problems in the world. You know, I worry about Asia, what can go wrong. The thing that worries me the most about Asia is water. If China and India don't solve their water problems, it's not going to be an Asia study, an Asia story. I've been around the world a couple of times, Pimm. I've seen cities and civilizations which just disappeared because the water disappeared. Well, that's happening in northern China and northern India right now. So gigantic fortunes are going to be made in water. You cannot buy water itself. At least I don't know how to buy water itself, unless you buy a lake or something. The only way you can play water is to buy companies that treat water, cleanse water, clean water, transport water. Find companies which are going to solve the water problem.
Would that include things like desalination plants? I mean, obviously there are companies that are, engaged in this process, but there's a very long lead time to build these kinds of projects. Do you think that governments will allow them to stay in private hands?
Oh, yes. Most governments will. Some, obviously, somewhere along the line will start blaming the private sector for their problems, for the water problems. But no, without private enterprise, most water problems will not be solved. Yes, the companies that are building desalination plants will certainly do well, but the ones that clean water will do better, or treat water, because that is a much quicker solution than having to build a whole new gigantic plant to desalinate water.
What about the companies that provide the infrastructure, the pipes, for example, in municipalities? Is that an area to invest in?
Those companies will make money. They will never get as high a multiple as the other companies, because people are always going to say, well, it's just pipes and there's no technology involved. But yes, they're going to have very bright futures. Anything to do with moving, cleaning, transporting water is going to have a huge future. And remember, Pimm, there are 3 billion people in Asia, so this is a huge problem that's going to take years to solve, years to clear up.
Do you think that when people look at water that they are looking at a short-term solution or a long-term solution? Should people be getting invested and stay there for, what, 5 years, 10 years?
I expect to own my water stocks for at least 10 years. This is a problem that's not going to go away anytime soon. No, unless you get involved with a bad company or bad management or something. Everybody in the water business is going to make a lot of money over the next decade or two.
Okay, all right, hang on, Jim. We're just going to take a quick break. Well, when you could go ahead, Jim.
I was just going to say, these are things you can hold through a recession. Even if there's a recession, the water companies are going to do very well.
Jim, let's talk a little bit about oil and a man named M. King Hubert. Let's talk about what Hubert's peak means and why that's important for watching the commodity and the commodity's price. Tell us about Hubert's peak.
Well, Mr. Hubert was an oil man who, back in the 50s, predicted that the U.S. oil production would peak in the 70s and start declining. It turned out that he was almost exactly right, almost to the year. It was amazing when you look back at what he did. And apparently there are now people who say that the world oil production is peaking as we speak and will be declining for years to come. I don't know, Pimm. I'm not a geologist, but I do know that nobody's discovered any major oil fields, giant elephants, anywhere in the world in over 40 years. I do know that every oil country in the world, nearly every oil country, has declining reserves, and nearly every oil company in the world has declining reserves. So there may be a lot of oil out there somewhere, Pimm, but we better find it quickly, and it better be in an accessible area. If it's in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, that's not going to do us much good. It's got to be in Chicago or Berlin or Tokyo for it to do the world any good.
All right, well, even if we don't find it in Berlin or Chicago or Tokyo, what about the oil service companies? Do you think that that's an area people should be investing in?
Well, they should certainly be doing their homework, because those companies are going to continue to make fortunes in the future, because the world's going to have to look for more and more oil, or to figure out ways to service the existing oil fields, or to get more oil out of the current oil fields. Yes, that's going to be a glorious industry for many years to come.
What about the future of nuclear power, Jim? We haven't talked about that, but what about uranium and nuclear power? Do you see that as really taking up any slack?
Well, of course it will. Many countries in the world are starting to develop nuclear power plants. The Chinese are building at least 25. Many countries in the world are now building nuclear power plants again. Even in America, the environmentalists are starting to say, well, maybe we should turn to nuclear if it's properly contained and properly controlled. Remember that the world's excess supplies of uranium are going to end in 2012, so uranium has a great future, but so does nuclear power. I own nuclear power companies because I know they're going to do better.
And just quickly, what about agricultural commodities and the pressure coming from corn going into ethanol? Think that's a smart move?
Well, I think one of the best investments in the world of any kind right now is agricultural commodities. They're very depressed on a historic basis. Fundamental changes are taking place for the better, including ethanol. Ethanol is an absurd solution, by the way, to the energy problems, but it's going to happen whether it's absurd or not. So there are going to be great opportunities in agricultural commodities in the next 10 years.